Всім привіт! Мене звати Ангеліна Карякіна. Це подкаст «Коли все має значення». І це моя колега
Наталка Гуменюк. І я сьогодні буду запитувати Ліну про те, як пройшла її розмова з Anne Applebaum, американською історикинею, письменницею, авторкою багатьох нагород, яка слідкує і за американською політикою, і взагалі за питаннями, які стосуються посилення авторитаризму. Але я хочу, щоб ти трошки більше розказала, про що була саме ця розмова, бо з Ен можна говорити про дуже багато важливого.
Дійсно, з Ен хотілося поговорити про багато речей, але в неї, на жаль, було не дуже багато часу. Вона поспішала на літак. Почали ми з її книги «Червоний голод». З одного боку, частина українських істориків критикували цю книгу за те, що вона буцімто прямо не називає Голодомор геноцидом. З іншого боку, Applebaum на Заході критикували за те, що вона якраз називає Голодомор геноцидом. Зараз, коли така кількість країн, така кількість парламентів, певна кількість, там кілька десятків штатів, майже 4 десятки штати американських на своїх рівнях визнали Голодомор геноцидом, мені якраз хотілося запитати її про те, чому зараз світ готовий був визнавати Голодомор актом геноциду. Власне, це було одне з перших питань до неї.
Мені, чесно скажу, було би, напевно, тяжче брати це інтерв'ю, бо ми в таких більш приятельських розмовах. Напевно, хочу теж сказати, що Ен дуже допомагає нам. Вони з її чоловіком Радиком Сікорським, який був колишнім міністром закордонних справ в Польщі, потім є депутатом Європейського парламенту. Тільки Радик зібрав, здається, $300,000 на машини для ЗСУ. Це тільки окрема історія. Він просто читає десь лекції, десь там, може це бути якась там Нью-Йоркська фондова біржа і каже, а можете дати таку-то суму грошей на кілька там машин? Фактично вони довозили їх і до Бахмута, і це періодично ти з нею списуєшся, вона каже, ми купили ще одну машину. Хочу тебе запитати, в якому настрої була Ен? Бо Ен може бути дуже песимістичною інколи, а може бути дуже оптимістичною. Вона, наприклад, по відношенню до України величезний оптиміст, з іншого боку, вона може інколи звучати апокаліптично, якщо говорити про якусь американську політику і казати, як все зле. Яке в тебе було відчуття?
Ти знаєш, вона була доволі обережною в своїх оцінках, тому що вона насправді може бути доволі категоричною і різкою. І за що я люблю її тексти, часто буває так, що якесь спостереження чи якась думка впадає, і тобі здається, що може бути так, а може бути не так, а в неї достатньо кристалізовані бувають прогнози, і дійсно бувають вони доволі категоричними. Я була під враженням якраз одного на той момент, на момент нашої розмови, з її останніх текстів в Атлантику «The Run of Rules», якщо я не помиляюся, якраз про те, що кейс напад Росії на Україну і зараз війна між Ізраїлем і Газою якраз говорить про те, що світ перейшов у фазу неконтрольованого насильства і так, дійсно, в більшості міжнародних конфліктів і війнах мало кого там рятували Женевська конвенція або ще якісь нормативні документи. Це якась нова фаза якоїсь нового рівня публічного насильства страшного, да, в якому нам потрібно думати, що з цим робити і як з цим жити. Водночас я якраз задала їй це питання, що цей текст, він звучить як велика загроза і давайте поговоримо про те, що з одного боку правил немає, а з іншого боку вони все-таки є. Тут була така розмова, знаєш, вона з обох боків. З одного боку все страшно і безнадійно, з іншого боку краще все-таки, щоб була Женевська конвенція, і краще, щоб все-таки там ООН збиралося, да? І краще все-таки, щоб санкції запроваджували, бо вони працюють. І саме про це говорить Ен, тому мені здається, що загалом ця розповідь, вона має такий, не оптимістичний, але такий тверезий характер, я би так сказала. Я ще хотіла багато їй задати запитань, але я не могла їй не задати запитання про Зеленського. Вона була не раз в Україні і особисто брала інтерв'ю в Зеленського. І ми якраз говорили, знаєш, в розпал цієї дискусії довкола статті Саймона Шустера в Time, де на обкладинку винесли слова про самотню битву Зеленського. Я хотіла запитати її думку стосовно її вражень про Зеленського. Так, вона його не бачила прямо в момент, коли писалась стаття, але чи в неї склалося враження, що він в якомусь опиняється в вакуумі, з війною, і що він самотній. Вона дуже цікаво розповідає про свої враження від того, в якому стані і як виглядає Зеленський через, можна сказати, майже 1,5 року війни.
Я хіба додам, я розкажу трошки іншу історію. Якось я була на Заході не з Енн, а з Тімоті Снайдером. Там ці люди, які організовували, дівчата з університету, вони попросили там підписати бейджик, знаєш. А це був такий захід, де було всього 25 людей, і він сказав, а реально треба мені цей бейджик, бо там всі одне одного знали. А я потім почула, як вони говорили про те, що ось це, напевно, Снайдер такий, знаєте, зазнався. Він вважає себе таким важливим, що йому не треба бейджик. Кажу, ви його не зрозуміли. Він мав на увазі, що це дуже неформальна зустріч, там всі одне одного знають, чи треба йому чіпляти цей бейджик. І от та сама історія з Енн, яка, можливо, для тих, хто не знає, може вважатися такою, вона дійсно там лауреатка всіх нагород, вона там модерує великі заходи, дуже зайнята, дуже поспішає. В той же час вона страшенно проста і невибаглива, тому що, знаєш, і в Україну вона приїжджала, і не просто приїжджала в Україну на інтерв'ю з Зеленським. Там минулого разу, що мені сподобалося з головним її редактором, там Джефом Голдбергом, вони поїхали в Миколаїв, вони поїхали на фронт, вони поїхали туди, коли небезпечно. Енн сказала якусь дивну річ, каже, я прожила дуже гарне життя, якщо щось станеться, що зробиш? Але в мене було дуже хороше життя. Але я хотіла сказати про інше, що мене колись здивувало, коли я кудись приїхала, і ми десь були в одному з готелів. Треба було чи то зачекати, чи то щось там нас не селили. І нічого не завадило Anne Applebaum сісти на підлогу в вестибюлі цього готеля, відкрити комп'ютер і почати писати статтю. Я була не в стані. Ні, Anne Applebaum нічого не заважає сісти в вестибюлі готеля на підлогу, на коліна, там відкрити комп, і поки всі ходять, писати якусь колонку, і всі кажуть, ух ти, як гарно вона написала.
Останнє додам, можливо, Іра це виріжить, наша редакторка, подивимось, ми так багато набалакали. По-перше, вона ніколи не відмовляла. Я розумію, що це там ваші хороші стосунки і дружба, але не було такого моменту за багато років, коли ми до неї зверталися по короткі коментарі, інтерв'ю або включення. Вона завжди знаходила час там поміж усіма її включками, перельотами і так далі до України і до нас вона завжди була готова знайти час. Це теж її по-людськи дуже характеризує. А друге, з тих людей, з якими в нас вже вийшли випуски, вона і Снайдер – це якраз ті люди. Я розумію, що в неї журналістський бекграунд, і вона як репортерка має бути на місці, тобто Снайдер все-таки більш академічний письменник, професор, історик і так далі, але вона якраз з тих людей, які треба на власні очі самі переконатися в чому. Їй треба поговорити з живими людьми. Ми ж багато спілкуємось з різними західними журналістами, письменниками, ти знаєш, вони можуть поговорити з 3-4 українськими журналістами або лідерами думок, і, в принципі, з цього народжуються статті. Вона якраз з тих, які треба на власні очі побачити, переконатися, поговорити з великою кількістю людей, з тими, хто ухвалює рішення, побачити на власні очі для того, щоб зробити якийсь висновок.
Мене, знаєш, що здивувало? Ми ж за цей час зустріли дуже багато відомих людей, там головних редакторів. І я теж спілкуюся з людьми там в Україні, приїжджають різні журналісти. Якщо бувають такі західні журналісти і редактори, в яких є там український фіксер-продюсер, який має про все домовитися, Енн, коли приїжджає, вона пише всім сама, узгоджує всі свої інтерв'ю, їй так швидше, вона сама може пояснити. І це теж, якби для нас, мені здається, теж для українських журналістів, теж має бути якимось знаком, що, якби не від статусу, не від цього це залежить все. Я маю на увазі там те, як ти організовуєш свій процес. Люди з таким досвідом і іменем, дуже часто можуть, в принципі, робити все самі, не покладатися на мільйон асистентів в той час, коли як інші люди, куди іншого статусу, можуть просто принципово щось сказати, що хай це хтось за мене зробить, що я там буду листа сам писати. Так що це теж якийсь такий досвід для мене, якби просто от такої взаємодії.
Ми якось змогли розкрити людину за гучним іменем пуліцерівської лауреатки на однієї поважної премії Anne Applebaum, авторки великих матеріалів, в тому числі про Україну. Ми трошечки змогли розказати, що це за людина, тож давайте слухати. I'm going to start with Holodomor. We're going to run this show closer to the date of Holodomor, and I've been recently rereading your book. Frankly speaking, I have to say I wasn't so sensitive before the war. Now, I mean, it's almost unbearable to read it. This part where you really describe what happens. But anyway, my question is, in your opinion, what the Russian invasion has changed in understanding of the Holodomor by the whole world. You know, for the past almost 2 years, so many countries, so many parliaments, so many states have acknowledged Holodomor as genocide. Why now?
I think the war showed the rest of the world that the idea that Russia could treat Ukraine as a colony, and the idea that Russia could murder and destroy Ukrainians simply in order to eliminate them, simply in order to make, more space for Russia, seemed incredible to a lot of people before the war. And I think since the war, it's become clear that not only is it possible, but it's happened before. And I also think that a deeper understanding of the word genocide, the idea that a genocide is when one nation seeks to literally wipe out and eliminate another nation. And it can be done in many ways. There's not just one way to do this. I think that applying that to Russia and understanding it, that's a factor in the war between Russia and Ukraine, I think that has also changed people's perceptions of Ukrainian history.
Apart from the fact that the parliaments are acknowledging, Holodomor as an act of genocide, what else? What are the rest, signs that this understanding has changed?
I mean, these things always happen very slowly, but I would certainly say that, for example, when the war broke out in 2022, my book on the Holodomor, which did fine when it was first published a few years earlier, entered the New York Times bestseller list. Suddenly, people wanted to know the history of Ukraine. They wanted to understand whether the Ukrainian famine was a precedent for the future. Not just my book, but other books and other works on the topic are now becoming part of college curriculums and courses. Tim Snyder's work, his book Bloodlands, which is not only about the Holodomor but is partly about it, is also part of that change. There's an eagerness to learn and understand Ukrainian history that I think is broader than just the Holodomor. But I do think it's present as a topic in academia, but also in common understanding of the history of Ukraine in a way that it wasn't before. If you look at the way perceptions of a country or perceptions of a history change over time, as I say, it often takes decades or generations for things to be understood in a full way. But there's a way in which a lot of the world is now ready to understand that history or interested in that history in a way that they weren't before. People want an explanation for what's happening now, because actually to somebody who lives in the United States or even Great Britain, let alone somewhere like India, the Russian attack on Ukraine is nonsensical. I mean, why would they do it? What's the purpose of it? It's not rational. People want to know what's the background to this? What's the deeper history? And they're looking, among other things, at the history of the Ukrainian famine.
I know that the comparison is probably could be called as rough, but still, Professor Snyder talks about it. Russia using food again as a tool. Do you agree to this comparison? And maybe there's something else new that you have opened, to yourself during this invasion in terms of, what Russia is doing with the tools it already has a pattern.
I actually think that there's a deeper way to compare Stalin's war on Ukraine, which among other things took the form of the famine, and Putin's war in Ukraine. And that is, if you look at the history, this is explained in my book, Stalin saw the idea of an independent Ukraine as a threat to him personally, but also to the whole Bolshevik process, to the project rather. The Bolshevik regime was threatened by the idea of an independent Ukraine that could choose its own alliances, that could integrate with the West. This could destroy the entire Russian Revolution. And it almost did, actually, because it was the fighting in Ukraine in 1918 that led to the moment when the revolution was the most in danger, when the White Russians came very close to Moscow. But also the idea of an independent Ukraine was threatening. It undermined the idea of Bolshevik universalism, that that our idea is, of how the world should be ruled, is and should be accepted to everybody. And of course, if it wasn't accepted by Ukraine being the most important neighbor of Russia and the source of most of Russia's food, the whole Russian Revolution, the whole Bolshevik government, the Soviet government might fall apart. And the Ukrainian famine was something that he carried out knowingly as a way of subjugating Ukraine and Sovietizing Ukraine and making sure that Ukraine remained within the Soviet Union. That was the purpose of it, and it achieved that purpose. Putin sees Ukraine not in exactly the same way, but in a similar way. So for him, an independent Ukraine that's a democracy, a Ukraine that's integrated with the West, a Ukraine that has free speech. This is a threat to him personally and to his regime. What he saw in Ukraine in 2014, lots of young people protesting, carrying European flags, calling for an end to corruption. This is exactly the nightmare that he had about Russia. He was afraid that his regime would end in a similar way to the way Yanukovych's regime ended. And so the attack on Ukraine is it's almost as if it's part of Russian domestic politics. He sees independent Ukraine as a threat to him personally. And Stalin saw Ukraine in the same way. So they have there's a parallel in the way that these two dictators see Ukraine. It's not just that it's, some territory to conquer. It's that Ukrainian independence poses an existential threat to them. And the source of the famine, the ultimate source of the famine, is that. And the ultimate source of the war is also that. It's also this fear that an independent Ukraine could create unrest in Moscow. That, I think, is the most interesting parallel between the 1930s and the present. Of course, Putin uses some of the tools that Stalin used. He manipulates food. He's using food not only in Ukraine, but he's trying to use starvation in Africa as a way to create unrest there. He wants to destabilize African regimes. Partly that will help him. He can bring his thugs in to sell their services to African dictatorships. He can create migrants who create problems in Europe. So he uses food as a weapon in the same way. But as I said, the deeper parallel is the way in which the two dictatorships perceive Ukraine as a threat.
Yeah, because my question was, using food this time, starvation, not like literally starvation, of course, not only in Ukraine, but rather, the countries of the so-called global South. And my question was,
in that sense, yes. Yes, he does see food as a weapon. He sees starvation as a weapon. He sees, deprivation and political unrest as a weapon. He's interested in creating refugees. He's interested in creating disruption and chaos. He thinks that those things will damage Europe. It will damage the U.S. It will damage the transatlantic alliance, and it will be good for him. So, yes, in that sense, in that narrower sense, yes, he does continue to use food the same way that Stalin did.
In this regard, rereading your book and now, talking to you about it, you actually wonder how long, how many times do we have to relive this pattern, at least in Ukraine. And for Ukrainians, of course, there's a clear pattern in what Russia has been doing, as a Russian empire, as the Soviet Union, and now, and not only actually in Ukraine, but also in Chechnya, in Georgia, in Syria too. At the same time, Russia maintains decisive role in world's leading organizations, despite all the atrocities that it's been doing actually now openly. In one of your recent texts, you analyze terroristic tactics both of Russia and Hamas, and you write that open brutality has again become celebrated in international conflicts. A long time may pass before anything else replaces it. So my question is, how do we actually survive this time before anything else replaces it? And what do we do to replace it?
I'm not sure that it's replaceable. I don't know that you can now reimpose an idea of respect for human rights, unless you have the agreement of all states to impose it. I'm sorry if this sounds rather dark, but I think the deterioration of the international system, which was always, by the way, pretty rickety to begin with. It's not like the UN Convention on Genocide prevented genocide in Rwanda. It's not like UN rules, language about human rights prevented human rights violations in many places. These things existed as an ideal and as an aspiration. The advantage to them was that a lot of states felt some kind of obligation to pay lip service to them. So if there were civilians killed in a military conflict, They tried to, ameliorate that problem or apologize for it, or to make up for it, or, they acknowledged that that was a wrong thing to do, and they sought to avoid doing that. What we now have is a series of conflicts in the world where civilians are the actual target. In Ukraine, civilians are part of what the Russian military is trying to destroy. They're trying to create terror in the civilian population. They're trying to dismantle the Ukrainian economy. They're not really pretending that civilians are anything but a part of the war. We see Hamas, when they made their attack on Israel on October the 7th, it was exactly the same. So the goal of that attack was civilians. It was a terrorist attack that didn't really hide that that's what it was. It used outright and really some very extraordinary cruelty, the kidnapping of children and the murder of children in front of their parents and vice versa. I mean, all of this was designed to create terror in Israel, and it was also designed to say, we, Hamas, don't care about your rules, and we don't care about your international law, and we are not interested in even pretending that we abide by it. I would say the Israeli, there is a way in which the Israeli, the many civilians who have died, we'll eventually learn how many, they have died, but the civilians who've died in Gaza are a little bit different in that Israel says it tries to avoid those casualties. It seeks to avoid them. Its soldiers are trained to avoid them.
There's a condition, in terms of support, the global support to Israel, there's a condition that they really, maintain those rules.
Yeah, they do. I mean, I don't know how well they're maintaining them, and it's a conversation I'd be interested in having after the war is over. Obviously, the accusation that they are not maintaining them is motivating a lot of people to protest against Israel, and I understand that. Nevertheless, certainly when we're talking about Russia and Hamas, we're talking about organizations or states or groups who don't care at all about any of that stuff anymore and aren't really pretending to care. That's a kind of new quality in international relations. I mean, I suppose we've always had terrorist groups that thought that way, but Russia is not a terrorist group. It's a state. And Hamas is a little bit more than a terrorist group. I mean, it was actually the ruling party of Gaza. It was a recognized political organization that had funding, not just from Iran, but from Qatar, and was recognized more or less by the Israeli government as the leadership of Gaza. It wasn't a tiny group of people, in a basement somewhere, secretly plotting some kind of attack. It was the open ruler of Gaza. It seems to me there is a difference. I mean, an Israeli friend of mine said to me recently, if you ask about a child who was killed by Hamas and a child who was killed by the Israeli military, I mean, obviously to the child, there's no difference to the children, rather. There's no difference. I mean, the effect is the same. But the men who killed them remain different. If you have deliberately sought to kill children and if you have accidentally killed children, there remains a moral difference between them. Anyway, I mean, that's maybe a diversion. But, but in the case of Russia, you have an almost more extraordinary phenomenon, which is that you have a state which is one of the founding members of the United Nations and is a member of the permanent member of the UN Security Council, signatory to all of these conventions on human rights and on genocide and so on, deliberately defying all of those things and deliberately seeking to undermine them. That's a new quality in international public life.
It does sound quite dark, but at the same time, you're right that it is still better to have Geneva Convention than not to.
I think there will still be states in the world that seek to use this language and will continue to talk about human rights and will continue to try to fight in ways that aren't that don't go out of their way to be cruel. But we are living in an era when a lot of the world doesn't care about those things anymore. Therefore, we need to be cognizant of that and to understand, where it is that we live now and what kind of world we inhabit.
Yeah, I think it's important to stress that still, many instruments do work, maybe not en masse, but still like sanctions and, there's lots of restraining practices, even what we've witnessed after the ICC issued, in order to arrest Putin and Belova for children deportation, we could see that something changed in the way they handle this war crime. I think it's really important to have this in place. It's just, for those who will be listening to it, and have this confirmation maybe of their thought that, there are no rules, nothing is working, this is a really...
So of course people should go on trying to enforce these things. And the ICC decision about Putin was very important. It was, first of all, I think the first time that really the world acknowledged this kidnapping of children, this mass crime. I think it worried Putin enough that he will now have to be careful where he travels. And you can see that he is now careful where he travels. It did put some constraints on Russia. It did remind other Russians that this kind of violation of, really extreme violation of, international law could have consequences. And I think it's good and important that happened. But as I said, it wasn't sufficient to stop the war.
Talking about the world care or not care about what is happening in Ukraine, the recent Time magazine by Simon Schuster about Zelensky called his battle lonely. I know these are not your words. You probably read it. But my question is, in your opinion, how lonely is this battle now, and how lonely it may become, in the future, considering the outbreak of war in Israel, considering the upcoming elections in the US? What's your opinion on that?
So I don't think it's fair. Zelensky is not lonely in the sense that he still has enormously important allies around the world. Joe Biden, the British government, Chancellor Scholz, Mrs. von der Leyen, who was recently in Kiev. There continues to be a community of people, world leaders, but also other kinds of politicians, journalists, activists, ordinary people who continue to see and understand why the war in Ukraine is important. I actually was at a dinner last night with very senior British officials who are directly involved in foreign policy and involved in the war. They agreed that ultimately the war between Russia and Ukraine is far more important for British security and for European security, even than the war in the Middle East. The war in the Middle East does create a lot of very powerful emotions. There are big Muslim communities and Jewish communities in almost every European state, and of course in the United States. It creates, strong and conflicting passions. And so people will talk about it and they will focus on it. It is my hope that there will not be a loss of understanding, nevertheless, of the existential significance of the war in Ukraine. I would not say that something fundamental has changed. I don't think anybody's estimation or understanding of the war has changed. There is one big problem that has actually not much to do with the Middle East, but maybe it's worth explaining to a Ukrainian audience. There is a problem in the U.S. Congress right now to do with the congressional leadership. So there remains a majority in Congress, both among Democrats and Republicans, in favor of aiding Ukraine and in favor of giving economic aid to Ukraine, bringing weapons, and so on. There is a small group that is not in favor of it. And unfortunately, they now control one of the houses of Congress. They control the House of Representatives. The new Speaker of the House belongs to that group. And he is and perhaps will be in future, making it difficult to pass the funding bill that is needed to continue funding Ukraine into next year. My view of that situation is that it's not really about Ukraine. It's about Biden. In other words, they want one of Biden's signature policies, namely the support for Ukraine, to fail. They want Biden's presidency to be considered troubled, and they want to create distraction and damage for him. It's mostly about that. There are some members of the Republican caucus who seem to be influenced by Russian and Chinese propaganda that they read and on the internet. One of the Republican candidates tends to repeat Russian, lies about Ukraine. I mean, you can hear a little bit of that, but my view is that the primary problem is just that this is a particularly nihilistic and what's the right word? And, self-interested group of people. They want the Republicans to win the next presidential election. And if that means harming the Ukrainian war effort, then they'll do it. That's my view of it. As you and I are speaking, we're still in the middle of that argument, and I don't know how it's going to end. I mean, I know that there are all kinds of forces in Washington, in the Senate, in the White House, who are mobilizing to make sure that the money gets to Ukraine and to make sure that weapons and, crucial supplies get to Ukraine. I know the Europeans are aware of the problem and are also talking about stepping up aid to Ukraine. So it's not as if nobody knows this and nobody's doing anything about it. It's a very bitter and ongoing conflict. But as I said, unfortunately, aid to Ukraine got caught up in an American political squabble, and it's just a reflection of the particularly and peculiarly dysfunctional Republican Party that we have right now. I mean, historically in America, both Republicans and Democrats tended to agree on many foreign policy issues. I mean, certainly throughout the Cold War, there were no arguments about funding for allies or funding for the U.S. military and so on. Now those things have become partisan, and there are partisan disagreements about this war. I hope they will be overcome quickly, but it's a real fact. I mean, again, it doesn't represent the majority of people in Congress. It doesn't represent the majority of Americans. The majority of Americans continue to support Ukraine. I've seen plenty of polling that shows that, but we have a particular problem with a group of congressmen who right now are able to control the votes over when Congress will vote over this particular funding package.
It looks like a vicious circle to Ukraine, that in order to gain support, you need to demonstrate success in terms of counteroffensive, things like that. And in order to gain success in counteroffensive, you need to have support. Ukraine has been quite outspoken in what it needs in order to gain that success. Recently, we all read this text, this column at The Economist by Ukrainian Armed Forces General Zaluzhny, saying that now it has become a positional war, and in order to overcome it, we need a technological breakthrough. Do you think there is an understanding, among people who you've been speaking, the American establishment, European, British, what this war has become about, that it is highly technological war now, and even with all the resources that Russia has and all the resources that Ukraine is gaining, it is still technologically and tactically now very, very hard to move in any way, and of course to win.
Yes, I mean, I think people do understand it. I mean, certainly, I don't know how much the general public understands about it, but certainly the people who follow and pay attention to the war, are well aware of that. I mean, I think, of course, the problem now is it's not as if there's a single weapon or a single thing that could be given to Ukraine that would definitely ensure victory. I've heard arguments about what exactly we should be doing or what didn't we do, or, what's the right way to help Ukraine now. And it's not like there's an agreement. Ukraine needs this one thing, and all we have to do is give it to them. Then the war's over. So the difficulty now is figuring out what's the best way forward. My view, and I'm writing this now, and I know there's some people who agree with me, but we'll see. Is that we should also begin thinking not so much only about helping Ukraine, but also about defeating Russia. Defeating Russia means not just on the battlefield, but closing the gaps on sanctions, focusing on how it is that Russia is still able to build weapons, blocking that, whether it's through, blocking raw materials going to Russia or through sabotage or whatever. I mean, they're focusing hard on making sure that Russia fails, that Russia's not able to fight the war. And that just changes the frame of how you think about what we do. So it's not just about getting ammunition to Ukraine, although, of course, that's critical. But also, I just don't think we've pooled our resources, the United States and Europe and, Japan and Australia, and thought about what it is we need to do to make sure that Russia can't build any more weapons. I think we're at the beginning of that process now, or not the beginning of it, but there's more focus now on that as another way to end the war. We don't have, Ukraine doesn't have to conquer Moscow in order for this war to be over. All that needs to happen is the Russians need to go home. They just need to leave, and then the war ends, right? So anything that can be done to convince the Russians to leave is good, whether it's, on the battlefield in Zaporizhia or whether it's in Moscow. I hope that Ukraine and its allies will begin thinking harder along those lines too.
I wanted really to hear your personal opinion about Zelensky. You've met him several times personally. You interviewed him, and you said that, you do not agree that his battle is lonely. Still, of course, none of us is in his position and is doing the job that he is doing right now. But at the same time, I wonder, what is your perception about him as a person, being on one hand quite sharp about the Western support and about, the tempo in which the West is supporting Ukraine, and at the same time his image in the West, whether anyone, is irritated by his appeal, by his tone and things like that. If we talk about this article by Simon Schuster, there's been a huge discussion in Ukraine around it, whether it's correct, whether it really takes place, whether the battle is lonely, and other things. But it's like internal Ukrainian discussion. But in your personal opinion, how do you see him, as a person? What is his attitude to the West right now? Is his irritation by the West, in your opinion, has grounds for it? I mean, if he really has grounds for the level of irritation that he demonstrates.
Zelensky, stepping back, has been just an unbelievably successful wartime president, measured by anything against anybody. If you look at this war from the beginning until now, that he managed to galvanize, a Western coalition, a democratic world, not just Western, actually. I mean, the democratic world, there's 50 countries come to the Ramstein meetings, that he managed to galvanize that through the force of his personality and his appeal and actually his very ordinariness, the fact that he never has portrayed himself as a military genius. He's never, when he meets people, when he met us, me and my colleagues from The Atlantic magazine, he keeps saying, I'm an ordinary person in an extraordinary moment. And I'm appealing to you as an ordinary person to other ordinary people. In other words, he's been extremely successful in the way he talks to the world, the way he speaks to journalists, and so on. It is true that more recently there were one or two moments when they missed, the tone was wrong. The tone was wrong at the NATO summit, for example, when Ukrainians were told months in advance that there wouldn't be a statement about NATO membership. They knew there wouldn't be, and it's a separate conversation about why there wasn't or why that's another issue. Doesn't matter. They were told there wouldn't be. And yet when they saw the statement, that NATO produced, which was just some bland bureaucratic language, they protested. That was the wrong moment to protest. There are good moments to do it and bad. There was I am not a fan of the outgoing Polish government. I think it was a catastrophically bad government, and I'm very happy they just lost the election. Nevertheless, it probably wasn't a good idea for Zelensky to allude to them during a UN speech. It was, you can particularly that government, because it's quite nationalist. It was in the middle of an election campaign. Sometimes he doesn't need to express his irritation with other particular countries or with the West more broadly. It seemed like it only fueled
with Poland. It seemed like it only fueled this moment of really his work.
So in Poland, by the way, and again, I think that the Polish government was completely at fault, and I blame them absolutely. So stipulate. I also think that for the Polish prime minister to say, I'm not giving Ukraine any more weapons, which he did say at one point. This is Prime Minister Morawiecki, who hopefully will not be with us for very much longer. I think that was a catastrophic thing to say. It was terrible. And also it wasn't even true. Poland continues to give Ukraine weapons. So, it was some weird emotional reaction he had, but, it was very damaging. But nevertheless, it's not useful for Zelensky to criticize his partners in public, even if he feels it very strongly. He is a better conveyor of positive emotions. He's very good at that. People appreciate it. He's done lots of videos thanking people. There was a great one about Belgium recently. You probably didn't see it. There was a little, Belgium gave some F-16s. I can't remember now what it was, to Ukraine. And the Ukrainians put together a little video about Belgium. It was about chocolate and some Belgian actor.
No, I haven't seen it.
Thank you.
Gotta look at it.
No, anyway, it was nothing, but I have a close friend who's Belgian. Actually, her husband is a Belgian diplomat, and I sent it to them. They loved it. They sent it to all their friends. This kind of, Zelensky is very good at this, and the Ukrainian media and PR and even the army are very good at creating positive emotions. And when they do it, people want to support them. It's not always helpful to criticize the allies in public. Maybe there are ways to do it that, sometimes you want to encourage people to help you and so on. But Ukraine doesn't need any enemies. Should be a rule of no enemies. We are friends with all the leaders of all the countries in Europe, and we're also friends with all the leaders of the opposition parties in all the countries in Europe.
How damaging do you think it was in Poland among the Polish people?
I didn't think it was profoundly damaging. No. I mean, as the people were, the NATO thing was annoying rather than some big problem. And in Poland, you've just got lucky and you're about to have a much better Polish government, so it doesn't really matter. It's maybe a lesson for the future that, and by the way, I don't mean that Ukraine should lie or say things are much better than they are, or pretend that there is a success when there's no success. But as I said, creating a positive emotion that friendship with Ukraine is a brotherhood and it's a positive alliance to create something good. This is when Ukraine does really well. And Zelensky does do that, and he's capable of doing it. And I've seen him do it many times.
Thank you so much.